Hello, everyone. I want to make sure that everyone can hear me okay. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm just checking the audio on this to make sure that people can hear me. Hello, everyone. I want to make sure that everyone can hear me okay. Excellent. So I want to thank everyone for coming to this week's online Parsha class. Today we're talking about Parashat Shoftim, which is in the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, the last book of the Torah. And what we're going to be focused on today, at least a little bit, is possibly one of the most famous verses in the entire Torah. And for that, we're just going to get started and take a look at it right now. So if you will, just going to share with you from our good friends at Sefaria.org. This is from Deuteronomy chapter 16. And again, this week's Parsha of Shoftim, like last week's, begins in the middle of the Torah portion, this time from verse 18. Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha bechol she'arecha, that you shall appoint judges and officers in the gates of wherever you live. Asher Adonai Elohecha noten lecha lishvatecha, that your God has given to you among your tribes, v'shafetu et ha'am mishpat tzedek, and that these judges which have been appointed by God shall judge for you a righteous judgment, a mishpat tzedek. So this concept of God appointing judges is not necessarily anything new, that we have Moses who was appointed to judge over Israel, and that Moses was going to appoint judges to help him out. So this seems to be something similar, although we do have a clear indication that this is God who is the one who is doing the appointing, meaning it's taking God's authority in their own hands. Lo tatem mishpat, and I guess how is it possible that these judges are going to judge righteously, meaning follow in the way that God wants him to? These are the qualities. Lo tatem mishpat, they shall not wrest judgment. Lo takir panim, and they shall not respect any kinds of people. Velo tikach shochad, and neither shall they now they should take a gift. So all of these negatives are actually ways in saying that they are going to look at justice blindly. They're going to look at the cases in ways so that there is no favor being set aside for any individual person. This idea of lo takir panim, that they shall not respect or they look at a person, is almost to say that, you know, if you see someone walking down the street and you see how they're dressed or you see how they carry themselves, you might think that that person is a certain kind of a way, and yet, and so you may judge favorably or not based upon how that person looks, or whether or not you see that a person is wealthy or not, or is able to hold himself, as opposed to looking at the particular case as it stands. And that also leads to the next part, which is that v'lo tikach shochad, that you shall not take a gift, that you shouldn't be taking any kind of bribe that would change the way in which you would want to act in this world. Ki hashochad ye'aver einei chachamim, because a bribe or a gift blinds one's eyes, visalef divrei tzadikim, and perverts the words of the righteous. So that anytime you involve money into any kind of situation, that you're not necessarily going to resolve that righteously or justly, because the money becomes a part of any kind of decision making. And so with all of this as a description of what it means to judge righteously, we then have this most famous line, which is the command given seemingly to the judges about what it is that they should do. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. Lema'an tichyeh v'yarasha et haaretz, for that asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach. Justice, justice you shall pursue for the sake of living and inheriting the lands which your God has given to you. So in this famous line of justice, justice you shall pursue, that in the context, it seems that it's referring to the judges, the ones who are the leaders of the people, and how they should act righteously in making judgments in terms of what is right and what is wrong for the particular nation. However, this line has been used, I guess, in more modern times to refer more directly to anyone in terms of the fact that each one of us is commanded to pursue justice. So on one level, we have to ask ourselves, is this command for each of us? Is this command of pursuing justice something that each one must pursue? Or is it up to those who are responsible, the judges, the lawyers, the ones who are tasked with making sure that society follows that which is right? Our police officers, to make sure that they uphold the law correctly. And if that's the case, it's only talking about those who are, you could say, in charge. Does that mean that we as individuals do not have a right to pursue justice, or that in fact it is not our obligation to care about justice in our day-to-day actions? And I think along these lines you have something very interesting embedded in this verse, which is the line tzedek, tzedek tirdof, meaning that there's two different times, go this way, two different times that the word tzedek is used. And according to rabbinic tradition, there's no word in the Torah that is misused or that is just there for no purpose. There must be a reason for that purpose, and as such, you wonder, why is justice mentioned twice? And perhaps from this line of questioning, we could make an argument that justice is one that, on one hand, should be done by the judges. It should be done by those who are in power, and that there's a level for us as regular human beings to be able to pursue justice. And in fact, one of the most interesting articles that's come my way recently is about Rabbi Andy Bachman, who is a rabbi in Park Slope in Brooklyn, who is stepping aside from his job at a large Reform congregation in order to further pursue justice for all people. That's a big part of his rabbinate and who he is as a rabbi, and the fact that he's stepping aside from the rabbinate means that he's not reneging, he's not thinking that justice is only for the larger whole, that there is a Jewish role for justice, but that he wants to be able to pursue justice as a private citizen in regards to his work with other organizations, but that his role as a leader, especially in the Jewish community, wasn't fulfilling his need to pursue justice. And so here you have a bit of a flip that one is a leader who wants to pursue justice, felt that it was easier as a citizen, as an individual, to pursue justice. And so that this role, both as someone who is in charge, who may be in charge of only one specific area of control, may feel that that's the area that they're going to pursue justice, or perhaps, as in the case of Rabbi Bachman, that really it's as a private individual or someone who can work for a nonprofit or some other entity that can actually do more for justice work and making sure that like the Torah is saying, that we treat everyone equally, that we don't look at money as a way of deciding who is right and who is wrong, but we make sure that people are able to live as good as proper human beings. So that's one perhaps reason why there's two tzedeks there, to say in terms of as a leader or as an individual that there is that kind of dual pursuit for justice. There's also another interesting possibly dualism in regards to pursuing justice that I want to share from a speech given by Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid to hosts in Berlin, speaking both about the Holocaust and about the current war that's going on in Gaza, and talking, I think, very articulately about the challenges that Israel faces both in securing its borders and then also the moral challenges of fighting this war, and relating it to the moral challenge that was raised by the Holocaust. So I want to read just a snippet that kind of looks at both of those aspects of tzedek. The Holocaust placed before Israel a dual challenge. On the one hand, it taught us that we must survive at any price and be able to defend ourselves at any price. Trainloads of Jews will never again depart from a platform anywhere in the world. The security of the State of Israel and its citizens must forever be in our hands alone. We have friends, and I stand here among friends. The new Germany has proven its friendship to Israel time and again, but we must not and we cannot rely on anyone but ourselves. So in terms of what is just and what is right, I think that what's interesting is that Yair Lapid is bringing up that sense of justice is about to make sure that a single group of people is not going to be harmed in any kind of way, and taking measures of security to making sure that that safety is guaranteed. And so, in essence, protecting yourself, defending your society, defending your group can, I think, be seen as an act of justice. But then there's another aspect to justice. On the other hand, the Holocaust taught us that no matter the circumstances, we must always remain moral people. Human morality is not judged when everything is okay. It is judged by our ability to see the suffering of the other, even when we have every reason to see only our own. The Holocaust cannot be compared and must not be compared to any other event in human history. It was, in the words of author Kay Zetnick, a survivor of Auschwitz, another planet. We must not compare, but we must always remember what we learned. A war like the one we fight today, which looks likely to continue and which the civilized world, whether it wants to or not, will be a part of, causes the two lessons we learned from the Holocaust to stand opposite one another. The need to survive teaches us to strike hard to defend ourselves. The need to remain moral, even when circumstances are immoral, teaches us to minimize human suffering as much as possible. So the moral challenge of the Holocaust, that to never look at another human being as an other, but to rather see the humanity in each person, is also embedded in the challenges that Israel faces in securing its own borders. And I think here we have the greatest example of why maybe we really need those two different tzedek, those two different words of tzedek. Because it's not that tzedek, tzedek, oh, really, justice, we're going to pursue you. But rather, tzedek, this one version of tzedek, and this other version of tzedek, this other version of righteousness, stand in tension with one another. And it's difficult to actually achieve it. Perhaps that's why the text says tzedek tzedek tirdof, that we pursue after justice, almost as if to say that justice is this thing over here and we're kind of pursuing it and after it, not knowing if we're actually going to be able to reach it. And now I want to come back with thinking about that dichotomy in terms of the different kinds of tzedek in regards to our question about how do you pursue justice? Is it one devoted for the leaders, for the ones who are supposed to make judgments, or is it for us as individuals? Because it seems, taking the Yair Lapid's thought as well, that maybe these are standing in tension with one another, and that at times we may find it difficult to be able to live in a world in which those are two kinds of justices are happening at the same time. And for that, I want to bring up a teaching from the Rashba, who is a commentator on the Talmud. And this particular selection from the Rashba is taken from a wonderful book called The Halachic Process, which I'm going to bring up over here. The Halachic Process, which is a book written by Rabbi Joel Roth of the Jewish Theological Seminary about how halakha is created. And what he lays out here in the book is, or in this particular section that the Rashba is pointing out, is that there is a verse in the Torah, actually from last week's Torah portion of Parashat Re'eh, in which we are taught that we are not allowed to add or to decrease in anything from the Torah. And what that argument is used to say is, does that mean that you can have rabbis who come and add new things or take away things from the mitzvot of the Torah? Are they actually allowed to be able to do so? And as such, that the conversation revolves around the rabbinic right to be able to change Jewish law as we see fit, and whether the Torah actually allows for that to happen or not. And we'll talk in a moment about how this relates to the kind of sense of justice that we've been talking about. Why is the shofar sounded when people are seated, i.e. when we have the repetition of the Amidah? And why is it sounded when they are standing? So that when people are actually reciting the Amidah to themselves, that it can also be sounded. And in fact, there is a tradition to, when people are standing up for the sound of the shofar, which we're going to have very shortly with Rosh Hashanah coming up, that the shofar is sounded during that time, and then it is sounded afterwards when people are actually seated down. And so why is it recited twice? In order to confuse the Satan. That it is used to make sure that that Satan, the arch enemy angel, is actually not going to know that the Jews are blowing the shofar, and if they're blowing the shofar, that means they're trying to speak to God, and so Satan might confuse with what's happening. And so we want to make sure that Satan is not able to do his job. That's the idea. But the whole issue is the fact that the shofar is supposed to be sounded once, and it seems that the rabbis add a second time when it's added. So concerning this matter, the Tosafot, or our medieval commentators who are the grandchildren of Rashi, raise the objection that sounding the shofar twice constitutes a violation of Baal Tosif, of this verse in Deuteronomy which says that you shall not add to the mitzvot that are in the Torah. So why is it that we are allowed to add this second time? And they of blessed memory, meaning the sages, explain that Baal Tosif does not apply to the fulfillment of a mitzvah twice. And they of blessed memory sought diligently to substantiate this position, but were not very successful. Meaning that the rabbis tried to say, here's a good reason why it's important to be able to fulfill a mitzvah twice, but they couldn't find a good reason why that's the case. So, because there wasn't a good case for the issue of fulfilling a mitzvah twice, they had to come up with another reason why they were allowed to do this, why Baal Tosif does not matter in this regard. Rather, it is reasonable to affirm that there is no problem whatsoever. For they, the sages, never claimed that Baal Tosif applies except when he adds on his own, as, for example, a priest who adds his own benediction. And in essence, this is what is really key from what the Rashba is saying, that individual cannot decide on his or her own of what to do to add to the mitzvot. Rather, it should only be decided by the sages. And he goes on to explain that if you do that, if you have one person who adds, then you don't know, or actually Maimonides really refers to this, especially in regards to kashrut, that if you have one person who's able to decide, and then you might say, well, you know, I can do this, you can do that, everyone can do this, and there's no kind of stable society. Meaning if everyone decided what is just to themselves, think about it as vigilante justice, then the whole society won't be just, because no one's going to know what actually is right and what's wrong, since everyone's going to make the decision for themselves. And so what the sages say is that Baal Tosit, this idea of not adding, is referring to the individual, not to the leaders, because the leaders are the ones who understand what is right to add and what is wrong to add, and they're going to be the ones to make that choice. And as such, what's even more, I think, what's even more fascinating, and this is how it also relates to our Torah portion, is that as long as there is some cause, it seems that we are commanded as those who are not the leaders or who are not the rabbis making these decisions to simply follow what the rabbis are saying in regards to how to perform mitzvot. As it says here, therefore they are empowered to enact an addition for some reason, i.e. as long as there is a reason to do so. And the same is true of Bal Tikra, of do not take away, for a reason. As, for example, Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbat, concerning which they decreed with reason not to sound the shofar, even though the Torah required that it be sounded. This is the explanation that many people have asked about, well, if we're supposed to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, why don't we do it on Shabbat? And the reason here is saying that the rabbis had a good reason to say not to do so. It has to do with carrying the shofar on Shabbat. And because they said so, we have to follow it, because they're the ones who make the decisions as to what is right and to what is wrong. Here too, i.e. in the case that the Rashba brings up, the sounding the shofar twice, they saw some cause to sound it once and then again. And this is the key. And it is a mitzvah to obey the words of the sages from the verse, you shall not deviate lo tasur, which comes from our verse in the Torah, which I'm going to share right here. In our Torah portion, it says, Uvata ela kohanim aleviyim ve'ela shofet asher yiyeh bayamim ahem, that you shall come to the priest and to the Levites and to the judge that is in your days. Vedarashta, and you shall inquire of them. V'higidu lecha et devar hamishpat, and they'll give you what the actual judgment should be. Ve'asita al pi hadavar asher yagidu lecha, and you shall do what it is that they say. Al pi haTorah asher yorucha ve'al mishpat asher yomru lecha, and you shall follow what they say as according to the Torah, which has been instructed upon you, and upon the judgment that they say to you, i.e. that the Torah is laying out what the instruction is, and then they are deciding the judgment based upon that. Meaning that there is a reason why the rabbis are judging based upon their understanding of Torah. And then this is the key line, Lo tasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin usmal. Do not deviate from the law in which they say, from the right or to the left. So here we have a case in which the individual goes to the leader and goes to a judge and says to the judge that, or asks the judge to judge on their behalf, and they say, here is your judgment, here's what I think you should do, and then we cannot deviate from those words. So there's two aspects. Number one is that someone goes to a judge because we rely upon these leaders to be able to make the judgments for us in terms of what's right and what's wrong. And number two, that once we get those judgments, we can't go to someone else and to say, what do you tell me? Especially if I don't like what that first judge had to say. And by doing so, we allow society to function in a way that the laws set before us have a system by way justice is allowed to be enacted. But where does then that leave that individual? Because the rabbis seem to focus like on that first step on saying you have to go to the judges, you have to go to the ones who are in charge. And in fact, what's key in this verse is that, or what's key actually in one of the previous verses I read is in verse 8, is that, or in verse 9 I should say, is that the people are commanded to go to the leaders, to the priests, to the Levites, to the judges, bayamim hahem, who are in those days. And that is interpreted to say, you don't rely upon the rulings of the rabbis of old, you rely upon the rulings of the rabbis of now. Meaning that you have to go to a living, in the flesh human being, a human rabbi, as opposed to looking at simply what's in the book to say, here is what the judgment needs to be moving forward. And think about that individual, that person who's supposed to be in charge, that there is supposed to be a process by which you become a rabbi or you become a leader, but also that you are born of today. You are someone who may have thought, I want to be able to pursue justice like Rabbi Bachman did. Or you're someone who says, I want to help promote Judaism, and I want to make sure that the law, or that Judaism is continuing to be followed for another generation. So that even if it may be the leaders, that those leaders actually start off as each one of us does, with the questions that we have. And we're saying, I want to play a role here. I want to be someone who can pursue the same pursuit as maybe those leaders do. And that idea of not just relying upon those who are in charge, but to saying, maybe I should pursue that angle too. Maybe I should take an active role in deciding what is right and what is wrong, is I think something that's taught about by the rabbis, especially the Ramban or Nachmanides. And he says in his comment on the first, on the verse of, in our Torah portion of Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, that the Ta'am HaKafel, and the reason why this term Tzedek is repeated, Lomar Hadayanin Tzrichin Sheyishpetu et Ha'am Mishpat Tzedek, that the judges who are judging the nations need to make sure that they judge righteously. Vegam ata tzarich lirdof hatzedek tamid, but that you also need to pursue justice always. And how do you do that? Shetelech mimkomcha el mekom chachamim hagedolim, that you shall go from your place to the place in which the wise sages are sitting. For instance, Acharei Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai leYavne, to go after the great Rabban Yochanan and go to his place where he lived in Yavne, or Acharei Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who ruled in Beit She'arim. In other words, what Ramban is saying is that it is that each one of us must pursue justice. The leaders must be able to judge effectively or to judge correctly for all the people. As regular human beings, it's our job to follow in a similar pursuit. It may not necessarily be to enact judgments ourselves because we may not have the skill, we may not have the ability, and you don't want people running around to different places and different people and saying, well, this person said this person said this. You want to have a system whereby you can communicate and work together as a community. But that doesn't mean that it is that we have to give up that right to pursue justice. Rather, that we should seek to become a judge as well. We should seek that knowledge, that understanding that allows us to make those righteous judgments. That really is saying that we should all become rabbis. We should all become leaders in whatever way that we can to be the best kind of righteous judge possible for us. And that perhaps by each one of us pursue justice in our own way, for each one of us becoming that shofet, that righteous judge in whatever form that we can, that we will make this world one that is based upon the wonderful virtue of tzedek, the wonderful virtue of justice. And with that, I want to thank you for joining me for this week's Parsha class, and we'll see you again next week. Take care and all the best. Bye-bye.